Yeah, it's that time. Puscast time. Better than howdy doody time. This is the Persiflager's Puscast, a review of the infectious disease literature. This covers February 15th through 31st, 2011. I gave the month 2 extra days because it looked tired. And now to the usual blather I have to say before we begin. You can always skip this if you're listening, but you don't really want to, do you? This is brought to you by the Infectious Disease Compendium, a Persiflager's Guide, and Pusware LLC, available over at moremark.squarespace.com, where you will find my growing multimedia empire. This is CME accredited. Listen and take the online quiz and get a half an hour of free CME. Thank you, Legacy Health. Also, because it is CME accredited, I have to mention my conflicts of interest. The only one I really have is the huge sums I generate through selling the Infectious Disease Compendium as an iPhone app. When you're over on iTunes writing me a glowing review of this podcast, hint, hint, you can also purchase the iPhone app. Or, in case you didn't know, it's also a Kindle book and available through the Amazon Kindle store, or the best way to get it, I think, is through my website, moremark.squarespace.com. But otherwise, let us move on to the literature, shall we? I spend some of my free time in the world of the anti-vaccine wackaloons as part of my screeding over at Science-Based Medicine. One of the issues that constantly comes up is that we don't know what the safety of the flu vaccine is, that we release a new vaccine every year without doing prior efficacy and safety trials. Now, that's, I think, a specious argument given that the influenza vaccine is the same old vaccine every year with just slightly different strains. It's not truly a new vaccine. But how safe was the H1N1 vaccine that was done this year? This is a study done in China, who are noted for their openness. I have memories, probably not true, that China was not particularly forthcoming about the SARS virus when it first hit. But that's neither here nor there for this particular study, I hope. But they looked at 90 million flu vaccine doses and looked for side effects of the vaccine. And they found that side effects were indeed quite rare. They had an overall adverse reaction rate of 73 per million doses given, with a serious rate, mostly anaphylactic reactions, at 12.1 per million doses given. Rare and serious complications were unusual. Now, the interesting thing from this is the Guillain-Barré rate. They found in those that received a vaccine a rate of 0.1 per million doses of vaccine given of Guillain-Barré. Not only was this not an increase in the rate of Guillain-Barré against the background, curiously, it was under the background rate of Guillain-Barré in China. I don't know that you can say that the H1N1 vaccine was protective against the development of Guillain-Barré. As is always the case with these sorts of studies, association is not causation, but it would appear that the H1N1 vaccine is extremely safe and not associated with an increased risk of Guillain-Barré. Of course, one of the ongoing debates is whether or not the flu vaccine is efficacious, especially if you read the Cochrane reviews and or the Atlantic, both of which are, I think, suboptimal in their approach. You can read about that also over on Science-Based Medicine. This was a study that looked at hospitalization due to influenza in a population greater than 50. They followed a bunch of patients over 3 flu seasons, and if they got admitted, they did PCR looking for influenza, and they compared a vaccinated cohort versus an unvaccinated cohort. What they found, one is interesting, is that about 10% of respiratory illnesses admitted to the hospital are due to influenza. So 90% at least are not, which is always important in trying to determine efficacy of a vaccine, since a lot of the studies look at lower respiratory symptoms, flu-like illnesses, rather than actual influenza. The other interesting thing is that they estimate that the vaccine prevented about 61% of hospitalizations. Of the patients who were admitted with influenza, 36% of them were vaccinated versus 66% who were not vaccinated. So we know that the influenza vaccine is not a perfect vaccine, but they estimate that given that there are 300,000 admissions to the United States every year for respiratory tract infections, they estimate that these numbers would double if we did not use the current vaccination program. Just think how much better we'd be if we got everybody vaccinated. We might even have a little herd immunity to protect those who are unable to respond to the vaccine. I think it was the last podcast I talked about the studies that show long-term cardioprotective effects of the influenza vaccine. This also shows short-term hospitalization effects of getting the influenza vaccine. The influenza vaccine has a lot of interesting and beneficial effects in populations. As you probably remember, the influenza vaccine has a segmented genome. And this means that if you get several strains of influenza in a pig or a human, it can take a little bit of genome from one strain and a little bit of genome from another, and voila, you have a new strain of influenza. Sort of a Frankenstein's monster of influenza. There's my literary reference for this podcast. Now, the big fret, of course, is you have H1N1 circulating, and you have the bird flu circulating. H1N1 is highly infectious, but not particularly lethal. The bird flu is highly lethal, but not particularly infectious. What happens if you mix the chocolate and the peanut butter, the Reese's of influenza? Well, some Chinese researchers did this in Hong Kong. They took a bunch of H1N1 viruses, and they took a bunch of bird flu viruses, and H9N2, and they made, for hoots and giggles, 127 hybrid viruses by mixing them up, which occurs in the wild. And what they got were 8 hybrids that turned out, at least in the mouse model, to be far more virulent than the parent strains. So keep drumming your fingers nervously. I certainly do. One of these days it's going to happen. A highly infectious but not lethal influenza is going to mix with a highly lethal, not very infectious influenza, and we'll get a new strain that will be both highly infectious and highly lethal. Remember, you heard it here first, because I'm going to ask for the James Randi $1 Million Prize. I am psychic. One of the ongoing entertaining issues, at least I think it's entertaining, is looking for surrogates in the community that mark the onset of an infectious disease problem. For example, there was a huge outbreak of cryptosporidiosis in Milwaukee 20 or 30 years ago, and one of the first things to disappear off the shelves was kaopectate. And people have looked to see if their purchase of cold and flu products presages, predicts the onset of influenza in a community. This study actually found that it was the purchase of thermometers that predicted the influenza season. And most of my patients don't seem to have thermometers. It drives me nuts. I see patients in clinic, and, do you have a fever? Oh, I don't know. I don't have a thermometer. I feel hot. But this study out of Maryland found that influenza onset was correlated with the selling of thermometers by pharmacies. Not an earth-shaking conclusion, to be sure, but I like these little curiosities in infectious diseases. There's this ongoing theme in my podcast, or themes is plural. One is which infections are bad, but infections are bad for a lot of reasons, both to getting infected, but having an inflammatory process is a prothrombotic process, and people who have infections are more prone to a variety of cardiovascular events. As mentioned, it's part of the efficacy of the flu vaccine is to prevent cardiovascular events. HIV patients are a good example of patients with chronic infections and an ongoing immune dysregulation and a chronic inflammatory state. These patients tend to have higher rates of cardiovascular morbidity. The study published in Clinical Infectious Diseases looked at T cell changes in patients with HIV and found that even those who had viral suppression had ongoing alterations in their T cells with activated T cells and immunosenescence, i.e. waning immunity of the CD8 cells, and that this was associated with increased subclinical plaquing of the carotid arteries by ultrasound. Again, this ongoing theme, inflammation caused by infections, has long-term downstream cardiovascular morbidities, leading to my usual theory that everything is fundamentally due to infectious diseases, and that all the other subspecialties are just subspecialties of ID. I've had the joy of experiencing 3 nosocomial outbreaks of norovirus in various and sundry institutions where I do infection control. It's not fun. Norovirus is the most infectious particle out there, with 10 or fewer viral particles necessary to give you the Hershey squirts. This study looked at the outbreaks in long-term care facilities in England, and they found that the rates of norovirus went up, averaging 35 outbreaks a year, which is pretty remarkable. And then they went up to 54, and then 124 long-term care facility outbreaks due to norovirus. And they credited it to the alcohol foam that was being used, because the noro agent is somewhat resistant to alcohol foam, somewhat resistant to everything. And they found that alcohol foam was associated with a risk ratio of 3 for getting an outbreak of norovirus in your institution. Then one of the authors talked about the total incompetency of their doctors. Quote, in our intensive care units, we actually have a hand hygiene compliance of 30% with the options of hand sanitizer and copious amounts of soap, end quote. That's the Atlanta Veterans Administration Hospital, where evidently they don't believe in germ theory. My rates in my hospitals are upwards of 85 to 90%. But we believe in germ theory in our hospitals. I mean, I just can't believe that you'd announce to the world, yeah, hi, we don't know shit from Shinola at the Atlanta Veterans Administration Hospital. But anyway, the topic is feces here because it is diarrhea. One of the things I always tell people when they leave a room is that they should feel comfortable licking their hands. Maybe that's not the case when it comes to noro infections. And certainly when I have a patient with a gastroenteritis, I foam and wash because I believe in germ theory. But the take-home, I think, is that if you have a norovirus outbreak, you need to rely on more than alcohol foam to keep it at bay. You need healthcare providers who understand germ theory. Jesus, 30%. Trying to determine whether or not there's causality in medicine remains difficult, despite what practitioners of acupuncture and homeopathy would say. There's been this ongoing debate as to what does CMV do when it reactivates in ICU patients. Studies in JAMA suggested it increased morbidity and mortality, but there are always issues with these kinds of studies. So this study looked at 97 adult patients who were seropositive who had sepsis in the ICU, and they regressively looked for CMV in leukocytes, plasma, and tracheal secretions on a weekly basis. And they found that CMV reactivation was common. It occurred in 41% of patients. Herpes simplex reactivation was also common. It occurred in 65% of patients. Reactivation of herpes and CMV is common in septic patients. Did the patient's reactivation lead to increased mortality in this study? No. Did they have increased morbidity? Yes. But was it causal? They don't know. They point out that the longer you're in the ICU, the more likely you are on a weekly basis to have a positive CMV. So the issue as to whether or not this was causal is still uncertain. So what you can say is that CMV reactivation is common in the ICU. It may or may not be associated with mortality, depending on how you define reactivation, and it may or may not be associated with increased morbidity, but it's still uncertain. And then the whole issue as to whether or not treatment is going to have efficacy is up in the air. So often in medicine, it seems that the more you know, the less you know. We live in a relatively clean world, except, of course, for my 13-year-old, whose theory about cleaning dishes in his room is that the food matter on the plates needs to evolve into a life form that wants to clean itself. Be that as it may, there's an interesting article in the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at the risk of asthma, and they compared kids who were grown on farms, well, they weren't grown on farms, they were raised on farms, with kids raised in the big city. And children who are raised on the farms have decreased rates of both asthma and atopy. The other interesting thing is that the kids on the farm were exposed to wide varieties of bacteria from day one compared to kids raised in the city. So being exposed early in your immune system to lots of antigens is important in early immune development and prevents the development of asthma. Of course, association is not causation, but it's an interesting epidemiologic study. And this, of course, gets back to the anti-vaccine wackaloons, whose current motto is too many, too soon. They somehow think that the paucity of antigens that a child gets in the vaccine series is too much for their little tiny immune system to handle. Yet, when you look at this study in the New England Journal of Medicine, you see that children raised on farms are exposed to a voluminous amount of bacterial and other antigens as they grow up, and it's actually beneficial. One would wonder if sticking to the vaccine schedule in city kids, amongst other things, would also lead to a decrease in asthma. I would doubt it, mostly because the amount of antigens in the vaccine series is minuscule compared to the amount of antigens one gets from life or being raised on a farm. Staph aureus susceptibility is defined to vancomycin as an MIC of less than or equal to 2 micrograms per mil. The MIC of Staph aureus to vancomycin can be 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2.0, and all be susceptible, but as that MIC increases, success rates fall for the treatment of Staph aureus using vancomycin. What then, you might ask, and I'm sure you are asking, is the relative rates of higher MIC Staph aureus to vancomycin? This study looked at a whopping 8,249 MRSAs and 11,755 MSSAs that were collected as part of the tigacycline surveillance trial. The good news is they found no vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus. The bad news is that the MIC is creeping up for both MSSA and MRSA to Staph aureus. For example, they found that 4% of all Staph aureus, or should that be Staph aureae? The plural of Elvis is Elvi. But anyway, 4% of Staph aureus had elevated MICs to vancomycin, 5.3% of the MRSAs, but importantly, and you may not think about this, 3% of the MSSAs had vancomycin creep. And this is occurring across the board. For MSSA, it went from 4% in 2004 to 7% in 2009. This is a 5-year collection of Staph aureae. And for MSSA, the rates went from 2.6% to 5.6%. So across the board, anywhere between 5% of your MSSA and 7% of your MRSA in 2009 had elevated MICs to vancomycin. Again, not resistant, but you're going to have higher failure rates. So if you're going to have to treat a patient with vancomycin, don't just stop at the S. I think you should check the MIC, and if it's 1 or greater, you got to start thinking about having a low threshold for changing your antibiotic choice. To what? Got me, they all stink. The plural of anecdote is anecdotes, not data. So we have some anecdotes. 8 cases of endocarditis, 4 of which were prosthetic valve, 4 of which were native valve. They had Staph aureus, Staph epi, some streptococci, some enterococci. Patients received 42 days of daptomycin. all patients were successfully treated. So, that is a case of 8 anecdotes, but still reassuring because I've been hesitant to use daptomycin or any of the other alternative agents for the treatment of endocarditis. It's nice to know that somebody else has been using it without killing off their patients. Always a good thing to do. Now comes the hodgepodge. The interesting things in the literature that I'm just going to mention in brief and not talk about in great detail. My life really is a hodgepodge. So, what do we got here? Well, first, you can decrease the symptoms of influenza if you give patients plasma from patients who recovered from H1N1. No big surprise. I think a cheaper and easier way to get an antibody response is to get, let me think, a vaccine maybe. Yeah, that's the ticket. But if you don't have a vaccine available and your uncle just had a case of flu and you get it, you can ameliorate your severe disease with serum. Boy, that sounds so science fiction-y and comic book. Everybody gets a serum and something happens. Maybe in the process you'll make Captain America. They looked at kids and they looked at whether or not they were secreting influenza with treatment with oseltamivir or zanamivir, and they found that kids who received zanamivir had decreased emergence of drug-resistant influenza and a shorter viral shedding period. Although the kids were sick just as long in either case, but there was less resistance and less shedding, therefore perhaps they were less infectious if they had zanamivir over oseltamivir. Chronic fatigue syndrome, as you've probably determined if you read the literature, does not look to be due to xenotropic murine leukemia virus-related viruses in yet another study that looked at patients with serology and PCR and found none of it in patients. That unfortunately appears to be a dead end as to the etiology of chronic fatigue syndrome. I still think, though, it's probably a post-infectious state in a subset of patients. Your race and your sex and your location will determine how you respond to HIV. Women do worse than men. People in the South do worse than people in the North. Non-whites do worse than whites. Don't be a black woman in Alabama with HIV. You're toast. COPD patients may have an increased risk of shingles. In Taiwan, they kept track of 8,500 COPD patients with matched controls, and they found an incidence of COPD patients of 16 per 1,000 person years versus 9 per 1,000 person years in patients without COPD. Whether that's due to the immune dysregulation of COPD or the fact they're always getting whacked with steroids, don't know. The 2-dose varicella vaccine, however, is efficient in decreasing varicella, at least in Connecticut. After giving kids the 2-dose vaccine, when compared to a time when they were getting 1 dose of the vaccine, their rates of varicella went from 48 cases per 100,000 persons to 24 cases per 100,000 persons. So, in Connecticut, at least, I can't speak for the rest of the world, people in Connecticut are kind of peculiar. If you got the 2 doses of the vaccine to the kid, you about halved your chance of getting the chicken pox. I was unaware of this, but Q fever is currently a big problem in the Netherlands. That would be the country, not the area below your belt. And it turns out that they've had outbreaks associated with goats and milk goats in that country. And as a consequence, they've had a ton of Q fever. Well, they looked to see if this had any adverse reaction to pregnant women in this study, and the answer is no. But currently, at least through 2009, Netherlands led the world in Q fever outbreaks. Go Netherlands. There were 2 cases of plague in Oregon, and I did not know this, although it was fairly recent and I practice in Oregon. They probably got it from their dog, who was seropositive for plague. We talked in the last podcast about an outbreak of plague associated with a dog in China that infected a large number of people. And here's some people who slept with their dog in the same bed, and both came down with bubonic plague. Neither of them died. Take-home message, don't sleep with your dog. And there was an unfortunate death in a patient due to the plague bacillus. They were using an attenuated Yersinia in the lab, but the patient had unknown hemochromatosis, iron being an important growth factor for bacteria, and he went on to unfortunately die of the lab-derived Yersinia pestis. So don't sleep with your dog, and if you have hemochromatosis, don't play with Yersinia pestis. Propionibacterium acnes. Now, you'll find it if you look for it. It's not an uncommon cause of prosthetic joint infections if you hold the cultures greater than 5 days, and it may be associated with line infections. This study looked at 522 patients who had P. acnes bacteremia, and they felt that of those patients, 3.5% had clinically significant Propionibacterium acnes, and including endocarditis. So you can't necessarily blow off a P. acnes in a blood culture. Although, if you say that 3.5% of the time it was significant, then, let me do some math in my head, 96.5% of the time it's crap. Now, leeches are still popular. You give leeches to decrease blood engorgement after attachment of small parts of the body like fingers and the like. Now, the problem with leeches is they have Aeromonas in their gut, and they need the Aeromonas to live. If you kill the Aeromonas off in the leech will die. So it's standard when you treat someone with leeches for reattachment surgery, you give them a slug of antibiotics, usually ciprofloxacin, to kill off the Aeromonas, because after that point you don't care whether or not the leech survives. This was a case, however, where the Aeromonas was resistant to ciprofloxacin and the patient lost their attachment. We talked about norovirus early on and how the Atlanta VA doesn't know how to wash their hands. Go Atlanta. But this was a study that looked at the incidence of gastroenteritis in the United States, and they found that norovirus accounted for about 10% of unspecified causes of gastroenteritis and 7% of all admissions for gastroenteritis. So if you have someone being admitted with the nausea and vomits with the Hershey squirts, think about norovirus. It accounts for about 10% of cases. And as I mentioned, it is the world's most infectious organism. Pacemaker infections rise with reoperation. So if you get a new pacemaker put in, your infection rates go up. That's probably not a surprise. Reoperations always lead to increased infection rates. This is my favorite headline of all the articles I looked at, and is self-explanatory. Transmission of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus between human and hamster. Hamster. The other white meat. We had a hamster for a while as a pet, and the first thing the damn thing did was bit me and drew blood. You know, it carries LCM. I was thrilled about that. Then about 3 months later, it escaped in the middle of the night, fell down the heating duct, and then in the middle of January, electrocuted itself on the heating coils of our heating system. And so every time the heat clicked on in January, the house filled with the smell of rotting, roasting hamster. And then it cost $400 to have the heating system torn apart and the hamster guts and the repairman's vomit cleaned up. I'm not a big fan of hamsters. No surprise, bacteremia is an independent risk factor for mortality with nosocomial pneumonias. We all know that when patients get bacteremia, they're going to do badly. But this study showed that when you got bacteremia with nosocomial pneumonia, you are more likely to die. I forget the comedian who said never use a drug that's named after your butt, but TB is associated with crack cocaine use in British Columbia. I thought crack cocaine was passé. I guess those British Columbians are a lot like Oregonians, completely out of the loop for modern drugs. Now, Mycobacterium homophilum, there was an outbreak associated with permanent makeup of the eyebrows. You know, people who paint on and tattoo eyebrows. They always look kind of crazy, if you ask me. Well, you didn't ask me, but I'm telling you anyway. I think people who tattoo on their features are kind of weird. But this was an outbreak where Mycobacterium haemophilum got into the wounds thanks to a freelance artist. And 12 patients presented with an eyebrow lesion and cervical lymphadenitis. So, if you're going to get your face messed with, do it with a professional. There have been outbreaks of people who go to Central America to get their cosmetic surgery, and that's associated with atypical mycobacterial infections as well. Atypical mycobacterium are common in water and other sources. If you got people who don't know what they're doing and sticking you with needles and not using classic sterile technique, don't be surprised if you get some weird-ass infection. Iron deficient women are less likely to transmit malaria to their baby. Ooh. Cryptococcus neoformans. There was several cases where they traced them to a common donor who had cryptococcus but didn't know why. All 3 of the patients who got the liver and the kidney developed cryptococcemia and pneumonia. So be careful where you get your organs from. I much prefer getting mine from strangers in hotel rooms. That's a joke. So it's always interesting, the different risk factors for developing severe infections and the fact that your immune system is not the same as my immune system. So here's some interesting immunodeficiencies, as it were, that leads to increased infections. Interleukin-12 receptor beta-1 deficiency is a predisposition for disseminated cocci. Single nucleotide polymorphisms in the TLR9 are highly associated with susceptibility to bacterial meningitis in children. And a change in the toll-like receptor 3 gene is a risk factor for tick-borne encephalitis. The more we look at polymorphisms, or poly-1 a cracker, in the genes, the more we find they show increase or decreased risk to a variety of infections. Not that you can do anything about it, but it is interesting that the answer lies not within the stars, but within ourselves. Ooh, I can quote Shakespeare. It's not often you get such an erudite speaker, is it? And then we talked about MRSA and hamsters. My second favorite headline from the month: UK investigates fish spa pedicures on health issues. Evidently, there's a fish called the Gara rufa fish that's toothless. And what they do is you put your feet in a water filled with these fish, and they nibble away at your skin, taking away all the dead skin. It's a fish spa pedicure. You can imagine with the water that you're going to be sticking your feet in, there's going to be at least mycobacterium, maybe streptococci, and God knows what's in the gastrointestinal tract of the Gara rufa fish, which suck the dead tissue off the feet, leaving them feeling softer. God, the world is a weird place, isn't it? And on that note, I will finish this particular Puscast at 33 minutes and 33 seconds. And so we come to a close of another infectious disease Puscast. This one covered the last 2 weeks of February 2011. References, including some not mentioned in the podcast, are available on the website, and you must know how to do the Googles by now. This is CME accredited, so now that you're done, take the online quiz, get a half an hour of free CME. This is brought to you by Pusware LLC, publisher of the Infectious Disease Compendium, a Persiflager's Guide, available as an iTunes app and as a Kindle book, so it can be read on damn near anything that has a Kindle reader. And you can get that either through Amazon or through my website at moremark.squarespace.com, where you can find the rest of the growing Mark Crislip multimedia empire, because the world needs more Mark Crislip. They don't need Dr. Oz. They need me. And there you can find my Gobidopus podcast, this podcast, the Quackcast podcast, links to science-based medicine, where I write twice a month, and of course my Rubor, Dolor, Kalor, Tumor blog over at Medscape, and my book, yes, my book, The Pus Whisperer, my collected first year of Rubor, Dolor, Kalor, Tumor blogs, rewritten, but to keep you amused, I left all the typos in there because people love typos. This is copyright in 2011 under the Creative Commons license. The music is by my son when he was 12, improvising on the guitar. And as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. My kids like to say, "Dad, are you edgy?" I will continue to follow along with you. Thank you. In dictation, I'm going to go watch the last quarter of the Blazers beating the Kings. At least I hope so. See you in 2 weeks, guys. Bye.